how you develop a plugin, pretty simple use cases, and these will be Java plugins. There are different types of scripting plugins that you can write, but we're just going to go over Java plugins. I can go over scripting plugins too if you guys are interested. And then we'll go over an example plugin and how you deploy and how you test it. So the first thing that a plugin does, or kind of the overall functions that it has, the first one is auto-discovery. When you write a plugin, you need to tell the plugin how to discover the application that you care about. One thing to keep in mind with this is it is optional. You don't have to implement auto-discovery, but typically when you bring up a Hyperic agent, you expect everything that Hyperic can monitor to pop up in the auto-inventory portlet like Napuna showed you the other day. So when you write a plugin, you need to pretty much, code in how you figure out if that application is running locally or even maybe remotely, but most typically locally on the host that you're running on for the agent. Next thing you typically write is your measurement portion of your plugin. So that just grabs metrics for the servers and services. And I think you've seen how Hyperic tracks metrics by now. So one thing that he put in the slide, only one metric is gathered on every execution. We'll go into that in a little bit. And then there's a couple types of metric collection. There's a collector mechanism, but I don't want to get into that right now. You can also write control actions into the plugin. So let's say you want to write a Tomcat plugin. You would typically write control actions for stop, start, restart, and you write that all at the plugin level. And then there's log and config tracking. So you can have the plugin tail a log, and then you can configure your plugin so you can monitor for certain patterns. And then, like we've already shown you, you can alert when a log matches that particular pattern. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to just jump in. So the overall anatomy of a plugin is when you write a plugin, you typically have a plugin jar file. A jar file is just a Java archive file. And I'll go into, actually I can go into it now and just kind of show you what's going on there. Wait, let me pause the recording. So in Hyperic, this is my workspace that I use to develop plugins, and I'll show you guys that in a little bit because that's what you'll need in order to develop a plugin typically. But inside the workspace, it contains all of our plugins that we release with Hyperic. So I'll show you how to download the code a little bit later, but you can see just from the directories here, we have a lot of plugins. And this is pretty much everything, or almost everything. But if we look specifically at a plugin jar file, this is what you deploy in HQ, and I'll show you the deployment mechanism a little bit later. But I just kind of wanted to show you what's contained in the jar file. So you can view a jar file with a standard zip command.
Can you bump up the fonts?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So what directory is that one again, Scott? Is that a plugin directory?
Yeah, so in the, can you guys see that? I can bump it up more.
Oh yeah.
That's beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah.
So this is my workspace. The trunk is our head. That's where we do our latest development off of, as opposed to a branch, which would be correlated to a version. And then we have our plugin directory, and then all the plugins underneath it. So again, here are all of our plugins, or most of them. I'll show you how to compile it soon, but it just kind of wants to show you what a plugin is made up of. These plugins can be auto-deployed on Hyperic just by using this tool called Plugin Manager that I'll show you later on. But when you look at a plugin file overall, you just do an unzip, we can see what it's made of. These meta inf, this directory is just standard what you get with a jar. It just has metadata for the jar file. And then you just see the directory organization of the plugin. The main part of the plugin is the plugin descriptor. That's the hqplugin.xml file. And I'll get into what's contained in there soon. I just kind of want to show you guys what's going on here. There are plugins also that are simply XML files that you don't actually have to create any Java code to run on. You can have a script plugin that you literally just write up any old scripting language that you want, Perl, Shell, whatever, and you can monitor your resource via just executing your script. And the plugin framework is set up to do that. But right now we're talking about Java plugins. Okay, so going back to the slides, we see the plugin jar. Oh, and the plugin jar also contains Java class files. I'll get into soon. The plugin XML, which I've talked about and we'll get into soon in the classes. Okay, so authoring. Okay, so when you think about how you want to monitor any application via Hyperic, there's a life cycle that's associated with this. Like I talked about in an earlier slide, you auto-discover the application, and we'll see that shortly, how we do that. But when we auto-discover the application, we need to identify the application, or I'm sorry, the server. And again, the server is a daemon process, typically. It could be anything, but typically, rule of thumb is it's a daemon process. So the way that we do this, and this usually happens implicitly, we just say that the install path is always going to be static and unique for that server. And we can get the install path via a set of commands that we'll go over. So what we do is we just kind of say, this is the auto inventory identifier for this server, and that'll never change. If it did change, then HQ would think that it's a new server, just because we need to have a way to reconstruct the unique ID so that the server can always identify which server the agent's talking about or which resource the agent's talking about. So keep that in mind. So also, you need to create the configuration. So what Nakuna was showing you earlier, when you bring up a Postgres instance, I believe, she showed you that there's a JDBC URL, a username, and password. That's pretty typical with any type of plugin. You need to specify, when you author the plugin, the configuration that is needed in order to connect to the application to monitor it. Makes sense, right? Hopefully. So at that point, we can connect and grab whatever information we want from the server. Sometimes you don't need that information. Let's say you're just tailing log files or whatever. And, well, if you're tailing a log file, the configuration would actually be the log file path. So that's another example of a configuration parameter. So when you're going about this, you also need to figure out from the application, how do I get data from the application? So writing a plugin is kind of an art form. There are a couple different parts to it. One is you have to know how to write a plugin in terms of how you author it, how you construct the jar files, and so on and so forth. Another part of it is you need to figure out how to actually get data from the application. So what I've always said is, we need a couple different types of people when we're going to author a plugin. we need the person who knows how to write the plugin, which, would be us being a representative of Hyperic, and then we would need the person who is an expert, hopefully an expert, in the application that we're monitoring to not only grab the data, but get the data in the most efficient ways. In some of our plugins, we don't grab the data in the most efficient ways. Mainly the Oracle plugin comes to mind, and people complain about that, and it really can impact the Oracle server. So you need to understand how to grab the data. That's what he's saying there. So the excuse me. Oh man, jumped the gun. Okay. So the requirements going forward, we're going to need Java 1.6, Maven, and an HQ agent for testing. One thing, too, that I would recommend is, and I alluded to this before, and I'll go over it in a little bit, is downloading the Hyperic source tree. And not to make modifications or to even necessarily go into the code to understand it, just so that it's set up to compile plugins easily. And I'll go over that. Okay. I'm going to skip around on these slides a little bit because I think the ordering could be a little bit better. So one takeaway, if you don't, come out of this knowing how to write a plugin, and it's not the easiest task. You're going to need to practice. But one takeaway that I'd like everybody to come out of this room and understand is that the plugins drive Hyperic. Everything that you see in Hyperic essentially is was constructed in a plugin. So here, let me go into Hyperic and show you this. I'm going to share my browser. Okay. So let's say we go into this Linux server. And we go into specifically the MySQL resource. Okay. First of all, MySQL stats is a resource type that's created inside of a plugin. So literally in the MySQL HQ plugin.xml, I wrote this plugin, so I specified the server name to be MySQL stats, and then we monitor different versions. So when you see MySQL stats 5.1.x, that comes from the plugin descriptor. So that's what this is showing here. When you create a plugin.xml, you have to kind of give it the metadata in order so that Hyperic understands what you're monitoring. So maybe I should just go into the XML file. I think that would be easier. Okay. So inside this particular plugin, Armand created a server name or a server type called demo server. Similarly, in the MySQL plugin, that's what I did. I just created MySQL stats, so that's what you see as a type here. And then we have the different phases of the life cycle of the plugin, and I'll go into this in a little bit. But essentially, auto inventory. So this is the class that you're actually writing the code in to discover whether or not you're running the application that you want to monitor. It's called discovery.java, and I'll go into this class in a little bit. And then also, we have another plugin type called measurement, and there's a class called measurement.java. And all you need to do in terms of Java is inherit from a parent measurement class. And I'll go into that so that you can pass up the values as the agent calls in to get specific metrics. The config option for this plugin that the user needs to configure is process ID. So, going into the slides, So literally, just as you saw the JDBC URL, username, and password, we see the process.id here. So the user in this plugin would just specify a process ID, and that's how we're going to figure out that we want to monitor this particular process. Okay? And then there's associated code that I'll go over in a couple minutes in order to set up this whole structure. Okay. Going back to the XML file, we have a couple metrics that we want to collect called this. One is availability, and you're going to see availability with any type of metric that is collected pretty much.
Is it required?
I think you can get away without actually specifying availability, but in the UI it'll look weird. Because typically all resources, or no, not typically, all resources have availability. Whether or not it makes sense is another story. Sometimes availability doesn't make sense with a resource, but that's how HQ is constructed. So another metric that we're grabbing is called demo metric. I'll get into what the alias is, and we went over what the indicator is as well. So these are going to show up immediately when you actually enable this resource type in the metrics that you're seeing by default, and they're going to be validated when the user enters the configuration. Underneath this, we have a service type. And it's kind of weird how it says service name equals demo service. It should be like type name or even type equals demo service, because all these is metadata that describes the actual instances that you're going to be monitoring. So demo service is a service type, and we kind of talked about that earlier. So anytime you see Linux or AIX or whatever, those are types that were set up by the plugin writer. And those are platform types. And we don't really get into how to create platforms via a plugin, but that's possible too. The demo service also has configuration. The configuration for a service is a little bit different. I don't want to get into it too much, but there is service, and that's just I'm sure I'll get into that as we go into the meat of the plugin, but there's a configuration option called service ID. Then there are these metrics, availability and demo metric. One thing that trips people up a lot is this whole concept of the template. It's kind of weird to describe, but the template essentially, the way that the libraries are called in the agent, the template gives enough information in order for the method to know how to collect the data. So in the Postgres plugin, we'll see like JDBC URL, username, and password, and inside of the template. And the reason for that is so that the availability metric knows how to go out and reach out to the Postgres server and see if it's alive. Same thing for the demo metric. If this were Postgres, we would need to give it the JDBC URL and password so that it knows how to collect the data. And you set all of this information up when you discover the process. So there's a bit of a flow to how this is all set up. Lastly, there's a help section. The help section, you can view that when you actually set up the configuration for a plugin, which is kind of nice. So this help section shows you exactly what you need in order to set up the MySQL server. So when you write a plugin, you typically want to write a help section. Sometimes people don't see it because it's at the bottom of the page, but it's there, and it gives you a lot of useful information. So for MySQL, here are all the steps to be able to grant the user privileges in order to see the metrics, and so it just goes over the types of configuration that we use. Okay. So real quick, I know this can be overwhelming. So is everybody following this so far? I mean. Okay. Do you have questions that you want to ask now, or do you want to wait?
I have specific questions, so once you go over these, I will.
Okay, sure. And if anybody has questions, just let me know. Okay. So let's go into the actual code. And let me see. So first of all, there are more examples. So server name is actually, again, the server type, and you see that with the names. They always appended to the names. Again, these are the types. Here, let me show you an example of where else you'd see the types. Let's say I wanted to create a MySQL instance manually. Let's say auto inventory isn't working for some reason, which could happen. So I need to go in, I need to manually set up MySQL for monitoring. So what I do is say MySQL server and set up this type. So again, all of these types were defined by plugin writers. And so I would need to specify my MySQL stats and the version associated with it. So let's say it's 5.1, and the install path. And again, like I talked about, this install path, it doesn't matter what it is, it just needs to be a unique key that's static and that you can always associate with the server resource that you're creating, or else things get screwed up. And so I'm just going to say /10, because that's never going to change. Okay, so I just created my MySQL stats without auto inventory. So point being, you don't need auto inventory, or if there's anything ever wrong with auto inventory, and I'll kind of get into that particular, there's one edge case there that probably should know about. But if there's anything ever wrong, you can manually create these resources. And you can create any resource that you want. So it's kind of nice. All right. All right, let's get into the code. So I'm going to switch back and forth between the slides and the real code. Okay, so first of all, this is the plugin XML that we talked about. We'll get into how these configuration options are read by the auto inventory part, and how this template is used, again, to be able to collect the metrics. And then, again, this is the help section. Went into this. Okay. So this is the actual code that you need to implement in order to gather the servers that you want to monitor. So let's look at the Java code. So everything's in source main Java, and then this is the standard Hyperic package name for all plugins, or Hyperic plugin demo. You can create whatever you want for this directory structure. You just need to keep it the same as the package path here. Okay. Oh, and real quick, this is the path. And so discovery, we know, is in the org.hyperic plugin demo package. And then the name of the plugin is actually demo, and we'll see that in plugin manager.
So in these plugins, you have to put everything in one package?
No, you can have it in multiple packages, actually. That's a really good question. If we wanted to, we could get rid of this package completely, but then we'd have to actually say org.hyperic and put the fully qualified class name.
Sure.
Okay. And so, point being, you can call other discovery methods from outside of this package. And we have a couple predefined discovery methods that you can use, so you don't have to write it all yourself. You could just write a plugin just by writing XML and just saying, I want to use the server detector class or it's called the daemon detector, that is available with the PDK. And that, I don't want to get into that too much yet, but you could use that with associated properties in order to not have to write any code.
You're just
Which is
wiring
nice.
it together, specifying
Yep.
the properties.
Yep. Okay. So,
Is that how you kind of did that Gemfire Lite plugin?
I didn't write that, but it could have been. I haven't seen that plugin. Could have been. So Gemfire is monitored via JMX, and one of the things that originally when the plugin development kit or PDK was written, it was written specifically so that you can wire together a plugin with just markup for JMX plugins. So that wouldn't surprise me if the Gemfire just used XML and used all the prepackaged classes. Okay, so let's look at the discovery. So this is Java code. This was written by Herman Lawlin. What does it do? The first thing you need to keep in mind is this class is discovery, like we outlined. It extends server detector, and it implements auto server detector. The auto inventory will not work unless you actually implement auto server detector. And it's painful because I forget it sometimes. And then you're like, why isn't this working? So keep that in mind. Typically, you always want to have a logger. So this is just good form. You always want to have some debug specifically for the plugin so that you can debug the behavior. And so the first class that you want to override is this get server resources. So literally, all this does is it creates server resources with the name, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. You can call it anything you want. But this is kind of the pattern that you want to use to create a server and then pass it back. So this is code that I write all the time when I write a plugin. And you're just setting different values for the config and setting different names. Okay? So this is very common code. Now we can see how it's translated into Hyperic by looking at the names and slides. So you can see the server name. So see the code snippet here, set name, server.getName, server plus 1. So server.getName translates into this Linux D6GA demo server. I think that's just the platform name. And then server 1 and 2. So that's what the code does. It just creates two servers of this type. Okay? And you can see how it's translated into here. And then
each of them have a different install path, or?
Yes.
Where's that like configured, or is that?
Let's see.
Actually, I don't think they have different directories. I think they're in the
Well, okay. You don't have to configure the, so the install path is essentially the auto inventory identifier. That's what it really is, even though the UI says it's an install path. The auto inventory identifier will be generated automagically, as somebody used to say, by the plugin libraries. So typically, I like to override this, and so it's very explicit. You don't need to do that. Okay?
And it's based on really where the process is running from, or something?
You can base it on anything you want. It
No,
just
the auto thing.
It's the install path, or I'd have to look at the code. So I don't like to take that for granted anymore because I've been bitten by it, but it just needs to be something that is static, that's associated with the resource that you're monitoring. So we can always identify it. So when the agent passes in what it knows about the host that it's running on, we call that the auto discovery report or auto inventory report, we can always regenerate that that natural key to associate it with the resource that's in the Hyperic inventory. So then we don't have duplicate resources. If you generated this incorrectly and it was something that's always changing, you would see duplicate resources show up in Hyperic. So that's something that users have found occasionally when this isn't written correctly. So I always override that. And this flow doesn't make it very clear.
We thought of using the install path sometimes to do some matching.
Yeah. So it really depends. A lot of plugins you want to use install path,
Right.
some you don't, and it gets really, really tricky to give it something that's static.
You're overriding which? I'm sorry. I guess you're overriding which variable to gather the uniqueness. Or did I misunderstand how you said that?
So in this code, it's not overriding anything.
Oh, okay.
I didn't
I'm
write
saying you're
this.
looking to figure out how you're...
Sorry. I didn't write this code.
Oh, fine.
Typically, I always set the install path.
So this method is actually defining two servers.
Yes.
That's all it's doing.
Yep, that's all it's doing. Exactly, and we see that reflected in here. They're just 1 and 2. That's it. Okay. So one of the things to keep in mind is this process ID. Oh, question.
Quick question. This runs like every how long?
This runs, so I was wrong on this for a long time, so I want to make sure. It runs periodically. I think to gather the servers, it runs every 15 minutes, and to gather the services, it runs every day. Okay? And you can override that in the agent.properties file. Okay. So this process ID, the reason that it's kind of weird the way it was set up in code, but essentially we need a process ID in order to know what process to look at to gather information. So there are 2 process IDs that are set up here by default. It's 1 and 2. It's just this I. So I'll get to why this is important later, but when we actually, or I'll get to how it's actually implemented in code, but when we want to actually collect metrics that are associated with this resource, we need to know the process ID to collect that metric. So we're dealing with 2 process IDs here. So later on when we collect the metric, we're going to have to know what process ID to collect it on. So the way to pass that to the metric collection method that I'll show you soon is by setting these configs. Okay? Question?
Question from behind. So process ID, I mean, like the server restarted, right? The server that you're running.
Oh yeah.
Process ID changed.
Yes, this is a fake plugin.
Okay. So usually you would not write anything on process ID?
No, you never want to use process ID.
Okay.
And this is just 1, it's hard-coded to 1 and 2. It's just an example plugin.
Okay.
Good point.
As long as nobody...
But I'm saying in another plugin you could use something else to pass for the metrics, which is not process ID?
Yeah, you can use anything you want. So typically what you do is...
you pass the install path, or you pass...
No, when we look at any database example, the metric needs to know how to connect to the specific database in order to connect to the database via a URL, username and password.
With some URL.
Yeah, it's how you actually connect to the application and then grab the metric. Okay.
But this needs to be fixed, though. I mean, you need a algorithm, not just, every time if you were dynamically creating a process ID.
Oh, yeah, this is bogus. I wouldn't put any stock into the process ID. Typically, what you do is you grab the information about the config from this platform config that is passed in to the method. And so if you have a URL, username, and password, you would say config.get this property name, URL, get username, and get password. And then later on, you can use that information because you've set it up here in order to gather the specific metric that you want. Okay. It's weird. It's cumbersome. I think it could have been done better, but this is what we have, and this is, pretty much the process.
Oh, good, good.
Yeah. And for better or worse, this is how it's done. I would have liked it so that you don't have to explicitly set these values every time you create a new resource, that this platform config is automatically propagated to any resource that you create. So you have the full config, and then you also have a context, a little bit more information about where you're running. But, this was written a long, long time ago, and it just hasn't changed, because it's really hard to maintain a good upgrade path, especially because a lot of customers have written plugins. So it's really hard to start mucking around with this stuff and then, guarantee that everything's going to work when you upgrade. Okay. So the next method here is discover services. So, like we talked about yesterday, platform server service. All servers have services. So when we look at the underlying services, we can see here. The code snippet to create these names were generated here. Service.setName, server, server ID, service I. Okay, and you see that here. As far as anything else that you get out of this, it's just another phase of the life cycle. Object that it passes in is the server config, so you get this process ID passed in here. And that's about it. It's essentially the same thing. Yeah. Okay. So essentially the same thing. It's just you do this in another method. Okay. So again, this is the configuration for the process ID. So you can, again, a user can pass in this information to the discovery. Okay. So the next part of this is actually collecting the metrics. All right. So again, if we look at the hqplugin.xml, it defines this class measurement. So we're going to look at measurement.java in this package. So in order to write this, you declare this class measurement, and it extends measurement plugin. And then you override this getValue method, and this getValue method is what's called in order to obtain the metrics. So there are two metrics here. One is availability, and if it's not availability, it's the other metric. If we had multiple metrics, what we'd have to do is there's more metadata information that's passed into this object about what types of metrics we're being asked to collect and the configuration that's associated with the overall plugin like I've been talking about, and this is the object that you'd actually get it from. So you could say metric.getConfig and I'll go into the code in a little bit, but you'd say metric get config URL, username, password, so you have all that information, and then you can connect over to the database in order to fetch your metric. That's kind of the basic case, not necessarily what's done, because there's something called efficiency. You don't want to, for each metric, you don't want to have an explicit connection over to the database to grab one metric. You probably want to grab all these things in bulk and then pull them all over and then actually look at something else. But basically, that's what you do. And that's the problem right now with our Oracle plugin. Our Oracle plugin hasn't been enhanced, so what it does is we have a caching mechanism for our JDBC connections, but you still, every time you want to collect a metric, you go over to the Oracle server explicitly to collect one metric. And it's really bad, especially since you should collect everything you possibly can with one query, or groups of queries, rather than just you fetch a huge result set and you only care about one thing, and then your next iteration you fetch another row from that result set. It's crazy.
Well, you probably said this. What if this is a collection I have not a single, as you say, group. I conducted the database and I collected a collection. I want to send that to the library. So instead of get value, it is like get values. What do I do?
Get values?
No.
Oh.
I have multiple metrics.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so you want to catch them, cache them,
How do I
essentially,
return
right?
this? Returns?
It only returns one. So for the MySQL plugin, the reason that it's called MySQL Stats as opposed to MySQL is we had a MySQL plugin that was extremely inefficient, and we had a customer who, it was a big enough customer that said they would not use our product until we fixed this. So I worked with them in order to fix it, and it was a good project because they were the MySQL experts, and I was the person who knew how to write a plugin. So because of that, MySQL is a good plugin. But what I did was I created a caching object, and it's essentially a static object, and I just update. So I bring down everything in bulk. I do a show global status, essentially, bring down everything, put all the values into the static object, and then every 60 seconds I invalidate that cache. But everything is collected within 60 seconds, probably a lot faster than that, and so I have everything that I need in the static object. And that's how I got around this issue. It's not the best thing. It's cumbersome.
For example, probably a script is a better solution for that, but for just for example's sake, I want to show the list of SQL statements in an Oracle schema, and how many times they are used per day, and how many milliseconds they are taken. SQL ID, SQL statement, number of execution per day, order by. Okay. So I have say 50. How do I write this here? I go once, and that is I know where it is stored. I go once and I collect in bulk. So now I have that information. Say
yeah. So I mean, you have to write a custom implementation for that, for the object that you invalidate the cache. But there is something that I put into the PDK called like JDBC query cache, something like that. You can use that object. Yeah, and so it'll do all the invalidation for you.
Thank you. I want to load because we are implementing an or extending an interface, and I'm returning.
So really, how do you return an array, metric value array?
You can't return an array when you write a simple measurement plugin. There is a way that you could write a collector plugin which returns multiple values. The collector plugins work differently, so I don't recommend usually doing that, but that is one way. And then you would essentially what you would do in that case is instead of specifying the plugin type measurement, you specify the plugin type collector, all right? And then you inherit from your collector class in the PDK. And there's a method, I think it's get values, and it returns a map. And so it just queries for that map, but you don't get certain things from that. You don't get validation from that, which is makes it harder.
You could have mixed property names in there, they don't have to all have.
Yep. So what you'd have to do is probably write a hybrid plugin that has measurement and collector for the validation, because all the validation is driven through the measurement plugin. So it makes it more difficult.
Event-based, so you can have only the one event, and at one time, and the interval is the one parameter that keeps your event, based on time.
Well, it's not event per se, it's not that generic, it's literally a metric. We have other ways that you can generate events anytime. It's asynchronous. So if you were tailing a log file, you wouldn't have to wait for this get value call in order to send back those events. They're just sent back whenever you see this event. Okay. Yeah, one of the enhancements that was talked about a long time ago for the batching issue is to have a get values method that passes in an array of metrics and that you return a map or an array of metric values. It makes a lot of sense.
This actually creates a metric value instance. We're passing in a metric object. Where does that metric object come from?
The metric object is the configuration for your metric that you've set up for it. It's so it's a kind of a, we look again at the
metric is a configuration, not an actual the metric value here. This is just the example.
Here, let me show you.
The object's the set of the values from the XML.
Yeah, exactly. So you can have. It's pretty much that. It's your template.
I'm just led by the fact that it's just reading back.
Yeah, it's confusing.
So really, in that method, we're creating a value with a name and a value. So, I'm just thinking in Jetfire, I'd have to go make a call out to the node and ask.
It's just the value. So when get value is called, it knows what the name is. It does all the work for you in terms of that. You can override that functionality potentially.
Right, we're actually going to some server and getting a value.
So if this were a JMX plugin, what you would do is each metric has a name or an alias. And so when you define your metrics, you define, so like metric 1 has an alias of whatever. If you don't specify the alias, what it does is it removes all white spaces and mashes the name together, and that's your alias. What's nice about always having an alias is that you can change the name without any problems. So I always create aliases. It's a good practice. But point being, when you predefine all your metrics, so you know what metric you're being asked to collect, right? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, so at some point I need to collect that from somewhere. It's
Yeah.
not from database, it's actually you have to go to the server to fetch that data.
To the server.
Or whatever the server is, or...
Okay. Well, so the data about which metrics to collect is here.
That's the name,
Yeah,
right?
it's called get attribute, I believe, which
now,
is a little misleading.
This is actually, the value is retrieved from the metric, but that's not what we want, right? We want an actual value, a real value from someone.
Okay, here, let me show you a more concrete example.
I think the explanation of the life cycle, how it gets initialized and how it collects metrics.
So this is the MySQL plugin. So with each metric, there's information about what you want to collect. These aliases are actually the names from show global status. So when I pull show global status, all I need to do is sync up this alias name with the output. You could do something similar in your plugin, right? Am I missing your question though?
So now, I guess I wanted to see the get value
Okay.
for this.
The secret sauce. Where's the...
Where's your measurement?
Oops. Where's the measurement plugin? Wait a minute. Oh, that's weird. That is really weird. Wow. Linux bug. File system bug. I don't even know where that bug would be. Okay. Yep. In a JDBC plugin, we use get query value. It's essentially the same thing as get value. It just gives you a little bit more in terms of the JDBC connection. But let's just say for argument's sake, or just for demo's sake, this is get value. It's going to be the same thing. And returns a double instead of a metric value. But that's how you construct the metric values, just from the double. Okay. So what I do here is I say string alias equals metric.get attribute name. So the nomenclature is just scattered all over the place, and it's not consistent, so it's frustrating from that respect. But get attribute name is the alias that we want, okay? And then from there, I think I just, let's see.
Oh, so the alias in this case is the column name.
Yeah, it's a column name. The MySQL plugin is slightly more complicated than that, but it will use that alias. So I need to see, in this case, what resource type it is. And so in order to do that, I use this object name. You can go into this yourself, but the object name is essentially, it'll give you, this information. So you need to do a lot of work in order to figure out which metric it is. And then you should have the information of how to collect it from the configuration that the user's entered, which is in the templates, right? And that's associated with this metric object. So let me just show you the template real quick to show you what I have to do in order to fetch this. So the template config here is JDBC URL, just like I talked about, JDBC user, JDBC password. Okay, so I have access to all this information in this method because I've set it in the auto inventory, to be associated with the metric. So that's how it works. Okay.
So when we say that Gemfire is not supported with the latest version of Gemfire 6.3, it's because nobody's updated the plugin to read.
It's because the way the detector was written.
Let me show you an example of that. For MySQL. Sorry to interrupt, Bob. Okay. So the way I constructed the MySQL plugin is I created this base version. This base version isn't really used. It's not discovered. You could actually create it if you were going to create the MySQL stats manually. When you create a server, you'll see MySQL stats base. But that's just because I wanted to inherit the same functionality in other plugins. So if we go down to another server declaration, we'll see these versions. So 4.0.x, and I include base. So, in all these versions, I include the base function, the base functionality. And in other versions, it gets slightly different. I include base with table. But when you actually create this server, you need to set up the version in order for it to act properly. So if we look at the source, oops. That's so weird.
That's pretty weird.
Okay. Let me see, how do I do this? Okay, so I have this method called getVersion, and all I do is, I think it's just called, I figure out the base. So first of all, what I do for MySQL is I have a PTQL in here. I assume, have you guys heard of Cigar? Cigar is the coolest thing about Hyperic. You can run any system-level commands in an agnostic way. So, when you're on a Linux box or Solaris or Mac OS, great example, there's PS and then BSD PS. And then Windows, there's no PS unless you're using Cygwin. I don't even know how well that works. But with Cigar, you can call PS on any platform that you want, and it's going to give you the same output. And it uses a query language called PTQL, Process Table Query Language. So what I do is it's essentially run a PS on whatever platform I'm on with this PTQL. State.name.equals MySQLD. What this does is it looks for any process that the executable is called MySQLD, and it returns you all the PIDs for all the processes. Typically, there's only going to be one process that's called MySQLD. If I'm on Windows 32, and I can see this from Cigar, but I'm going to look for MySQLD-NT. All right, so I get all the PIDs by just saying, I think it's built into the PDK, get PIDs with that PTQL that I constructed from that PTQL queries that I just showed you, and I get all the PIDs of the MySQL processes running locally on the box. Pretty cool. Then I can figure out the path that it's running from. So from the path, I can get the install path. So that's how I grab the install path. And then when we look at the version, so from there, I have grabbed the path, I have the installer, and I get the version by running that full path MySQLD ---- version. And then I parse the output of that, and I grab the version. And so that's how you associate the version with your HQPlugin.xml types that you set up. Okay? And typically with mature applications, with each version, you're going to have to collect the data in a different way, and that goes back to your question about Gemfire. So Gemfire, I've heard, I've never worked on it, they changed their MBean structures, or they don't guarantee them from release to release, and they have actually changed them.
Yeah, it is quite dramatically less.
Yeah, so because of that, it's very hard to support them.
Right, you've heard of the Yanni plugin for Gemfire, right? So there's the standard one that comes with HQE, but then Yanni also wrote one that actually goes in and looks for the compilation date of Gemfire, and then he can figure out from there what he should be trying to detect.
So yeah, that's how, and that, boys and girls, is how versions come about. Okay. So another reason to download the source code is to be able to look at examples of how things are done. So I highly recommend, I'm pretty proud of the MySQL stats plugin. I think it works pretty well. But, when in doubt, you can go into the source and see how these things are done with kind of the ideas that, get value, returns value for metrics, and, discover services, creates your services, get server resources, creates your servers, and so on and so forth. So now you should know where to look. And just to bring home the point a little bit more, if we look at the hqplugin.xml, we'll see the plugin types. Again, for the MySQL stats plugin, MySQL server detector is for auto inventory. MySQL stats measurement plugin is for measurement plugins. And there are other types of plugins. There's log track plugins. There's a control plugins. So these are the classes that literally govern this whole process, and we have built-in classes in the PDK.
So anytime that like a new release of, say, MySQL comes out, we'd have to go and update all these plugins accordingly for that version.
Yeah, and that's one weakness of Hyperic. We haven't been doing that. So, MySQL 5.5 is finally supported, but there are a lot of other plugins that aren't up to date with the latest versions. So typically, to add the support for that, if things haven't changed, like MySQL is pretty good. They don't change show global status, which is nice. So in order to add 5.5, all I needed to do was two things. Add this markup so that you can create a MySQL 5.5 server, and then add to the auto discovery that it'll recognize 5.5. So literally this 5.5x is from the MySQLD -- version or MySQLD -- help. I run a combination of those commands to see the output. But that's all that's really needed, unless it changes like Gemfire or like WebSphere or WebLogic, something that drastically changes these things from version to version. Then you may have to do more work. It may or may not be the case. Databases tend to be backwards compatible.
Sometimes they change the process name from one version to another.
Yes, yep. And so you'd have to go in and here, if they change it, MySQL changed their process name, I would have to go in and add a new PTQL query to see if we're running it locally for auto inventory. So as far as overview of plugins, it's almost noon. I think that's a decent overview.